So the problem is not so much who's going to be elected in the United States. They're only stepping into our domestic political debate, and it serves no one because if they alienate this or that candidate or campaign, think of how much harder it will be for them to engage.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. In this episode, we are joined by first-time guest from Washington, D.C., Dr. Andrew A. Michta. Andrew is a senior fellow and director of the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council of the United States. In this episode, we'll be examining a recent article written by Andrew for Politico, "The West's Biggest Vulnerability is Internal." Andrew, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Andrew, in your recent article for Politico, "The West's Biggest Vulnerability is Internal," you described the international relations landscape as a Darwinian ecosystem. Could you expand on what you mean by this and why you think this metaphor is apt for today's geopolitical environment?
I think it's always been the case. I mean, we like to talk about the rules-based international order, international law, but when it comes to core national security issues and how states interact, we're really in a self-help system. We can offset some of our vulnerabilities by engaging in security arrangements, alliance building, but ultimately, in the final analysis, it all rests on hard power and whether or not you can provide for your national security or not. I mean, to me, national security is the irreducible function of the state. We like to talk about complex interdependence, a lot of fashionable political science lingo, but I take a much more straightforward view. I think, yeah, there is dependence in the international system. There's nothing complex about it. It's who depends on whom for what. Just one example. We live in a world where there is no somebody who can actually, make sure that everybody adheres to legal norms and rules. The United States, for quite some time, has provided that as the arbiter, if you will, in the greatest power. Never really a global hegemon, but a country that can project power into different parts of the globe. But in the final analysis, it's a pretty nasty environment out there, and states get away with things simply because they can. And it has very little to do with social justice, political justice, or rules.
You've drawn parallels between key historical moments like Reagan's administration, Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, and today's global dynamics. How do these moments inform our understanding of current geopolitical shifts?
They're inflection points. There are times when power differentials narrow between states, and that in and of itself creates systemic instability. We like to think in terms of polarities. We're so used to living in the world of bipolarity during the Cold War. A lot of scholars now talk about a multipolar world, which to me is a pretty lazy diagnosis, to be quite honest, because it just tells you that there are multiple centers of power. Doesn't really help you structure much of anything when it comes to strategy. I think we're now, just like back then, in a period of considerable systemic instability, where those regional power balances are going to be key, and they will make a difference between, some larger global crisis or the system holding. And let me name the theaters right off the bat. It's Eastern Europe right now, the war in Ukraine. It's the Middle East, Israel, Hamas, and Iran. And it's the Indo-Pacific, where there's a storm brewing, as you know, because of the Chinese pressure on Taiwan. One more additional possible area could be the Korean Peninsula, because what you have is you really have an axis of dictatorships, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, working together in order to dismantle the current power distribution and establish a system that favors them.
You mentioned this axis of dictatorships. But of course, there is no formal alliance or entente between, the People's Republic of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So is thinking about this as a formal organized alliance structure wrong in some fundamental way? Because when we pick up a history book and we look at how the world was turning all those years ago, people used to sign documents, people used to do things that solidified relationships, especially strategic ones.
Well, there's some of it. I mean, China and Russia talking about no limits partnership, for example, after the Xi and Putin summit. Security cooperation agreements that I'm sure, and defense cooperation agreements that I'm sure are negotiated. They may not be public, but during those bilateral visits, whether it's Putin going to North Korea or Sino-Russian discussions, this is really about interests aligning. It's the enemy of my enemy as my friend, if you will. Russia is a revisionist power par excellence. It's seeking to relitigate the post-Cold War settlement. It's basically engaged in this neo-imperial drive and then tries to establish a sphere of influence in Central Europe. So it wants to reconsolidate the core of the old Slavic Empire, which means the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus, and then have a say, a return to Europe as a great power about what's happening in Central Europe. China is different. China is, to me, more existential. China is offering a different way of organizing governance. In the US, we tend to look at China as a military and an economic problem set. The Europeans are avoiding the military dimension as much as they can, though they put in the NATO communique from the summit in Washington that indeed China is becoming a problem for them also in the military domain. But there's also an ideological dimension to this. I wrote a piece several years ago calling it a free market for unfree people. It's the Chinese pitching a new way, a new path to economic prosperity based on the governance where the elites within the Communist Party, in their case, in effect, control every aspect of society. So one comment on this, which is kind of important, in our national security documents in the US, we talk about Russia as an acute threat and China as a pacing threat, if you will. I think both terms are incorrect. I think Russia is a chronic threat. Russia will not cease its pressure if it were to lose in Ukraine, for example. No, it's going to continue until that imperial drive is broken. And the Chinese are not pacing. They're really existential. They offer a different way of organizing society, their economic policy, and they're pitching this to a number of countries in what we call the global South. And in a sense, we're also then in an ideological struggle, if you will.
Andrew, I was on a local podcast recently, and I made mention that the People's Republic of China is really the West's Frankenstein, or geopolitical Frankenstein's monster.
We made
it. We made it. It was the Nixon outreach in '71. It was the Deng opening in 1978, and we all rushed in. It was like the economic equivalent of a gold rush. Cheap Chinese labor coupled to advanced Western technology. It was a marriage made in heaven. And they exploited us. I mean, we didn't see it come because we were too busy making money, and we love the idea of making money. So when you talk about China as an existential threat, I'm always trying to put that caveat that, yes, it's an existential threat of our own making. We never did this with Nazi Germany. We never did this with the Soviet Union. We could have. I mean, if we play the historical counterfactuals and the world was run by the same people that is running the world today, we'll be able to make deals all over the place and make money left, right, and center with every bad guy in the world. And yet we didn't back then, and we do now. How much responsibility does the West have to take for the rise of the People's Republic? And how do you think we can decouple ourselves since we have now gotten into bed with them? There's a lot of economic arguments saying that it's going to be almost impossible for us to fully decouple from the People's Republic. So they will always have their hands in places that we don't want their hands to be, right?
Well, it's mainly of our own making, as you mentioned, John. I mean, look, during the Cold War, we had COCOM restrictions, Coordinating Committee on Exports in NATO. You couldn't sell the Ruskies a 386 Intel-based PC because it was dual-use technology. The same went for basically everything. And the Russians could steal and reverse engineer what we produced, but they had to build it with their production lines, with their alloys, with their dirty clean rooms, with their drunken labor force and the rest of it. So we never had any concern that our technological culture, something that took generations to develop, would somehow be siphoned off and transferred. I wrote a piece several years ago calling the post-Cold War 30 years as 3 decades of delusion. And I actually think we built an ideology around what was essentially pretty straightforward. Globalization at the core was really two things. The Chinese opened up the vast near slave labor pool where you could engage in labor arbitrage and make 80% more on the dollar or 90% more on the dollar. And the Russians tied their energy pipe to Europe. And you know, the whole idea of energy transition and, you know, natural gas as a gateway to renewables and all that jazz that you heard in the European Union all the time. In a nutshell, it was greed masquerading as an ideology, because the arguments we were making was, you know, as the Chinese middle class rises, it will demand political representation and it will become more pluralist, and boom, Jeffersons will rise. I mean, Bob Zoellick, as late as I think 2005, was saying China will become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Who were we kidding? And most of all, you know, all of this was counterfactual. Because if you look at how nations rapidly modernize and what happens to them in the process, look at my own country, look at the US, the late 19th century, early 20th century, very rapid industrialization, vast expansion of the manufacturing base. Three things happen. The US becomes much more geostrategically assertive. So what the Chinese are doing in the Indo-Pacific, they're bidding for regional hegemony, very much like what the United States was doing in our hemisphere and beyond. You also become much more nationalistic or patriotic, depending on how you want to call it, and you become much more committed to the political system that made this rapid modernization possible. And in our case, it was democracy. So the idea that the Chinese would reject this commercial communism and all of a sudden start engaging in Western type of thinking was just simply delusional. Now, we did this for so long. And we took the jewels in the crown in our technology and handed it over to a 1.4 billion communist state. You know, I've been writing for the imperative of decoupling for the last 20 years. You simply cannot provide for your own national security, confront a country that's encroaching on your interests, and depend on it for 80% of your antibiotics and other medicines, most of your steel production, and on and on and on and on. Now, to your second question, I think we can decouple. We're just not ready, I think, at the leadership level to acknowledge how dire the situation has become. Notice we talk about strategic competition, great power competition. It's all normative. We're defending the rules-based international order, and it's all about values. And I have yet to hear what the win looks like. What is your vision of victory in this strategic competition? Whereas, in fact, I believe we're in stage zero of a war with the Russians and the Chinese, aided by the Iranians and the North Koreans, whether it's kinetic like in Ukraine and kind of a proxy, or it's information warfare or information operations, or theft of intellectual property, or acquisition of assets. You know, we could go into every aspect of that. But as long as you don't have to use the W word, you can avoid the reality of what you're confronting. I'll give you an example. Russia and China. Russia is fully on wartime footing when it comes to its production, when it comes to its budget. They're shooting for a 1.5 million military. They're rebuilding their ground forces, which have been badly mauled by the Ukrainians, right? And the rate of their tank reconstitution is such that they're probably going to be putting into service about 12 to 1,400 1,400 tanks per year for the next 2 years. They're pulling old stock from storage, refurbishing it. They're pulling some stuff that's damaged. Some of it's new production. The Chinese are producing more ships in a month than we produce in a year. Now, these are crappy ships. I'm not trying to say they're 10 feet tall, because, you know, just because you can manufacture a lot of consumer goods doesn't mean that you can build state-of-the-art weapon systems. But the Russians, building on post-Soviet technology with access to Western technology, have made some radical improvements in nuclear propulsion, hypersonics, and things like that. So, and we are in this crisis of disbelief that things have changed, and that they're somehow going back to how things used to be. And until our leaders start telling the publics how grave the situation is, I am afraid it's going to take a real crisis, a real shock, maybe even something akin to Pearl Harbor-like event that will shake us out of our, you know, the kind of stupor and our unwillingness to recognize that this is a Darwinian ecosystem, and that the people are going after our interests, and those powers are hostile to us.
Andrew, do you think that a non-kinetic shock to the system would be the announcement of a formalized alliance between these ne'er-do-well powers, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, if they were to have a public showcase of a signing of some sort of formalized alliance, that would send huge shockwaves through the system. I mean, it doesn't have to actually be anything other than a piece of paper being signed, but the photographing, the media telegraphing would be just enormous, and it would buy these powers a sense that they're together, even though we know damn well that they can't really work together in a way that, say, the United States can work with its NATO partners, or Japan and Australia, for instance.
It could be, but I think the real change will come, or should come, I would say, if we really start talking in terms of living with risk. We have created risk-free societies pretty much. I mean, we're so intent on managing risk. I mean, even if you look at the history of the war in Ukraine and Western aid, including my own country's assistance to Ukraine, which has been very, very substantial, but it's been dosed. It's been almost like an IV drip. It's been always thinking about what are the red lines, what are the consequences. It's this obsession with escalation management, rather than articulating some strategic end state where we want to get to. I think what passes for national security conversation in most of Western capitals, unfortunately these days, is still largely relitigating history. It's talking about the past, very little about the future, precious little about the future, some about the present. And rather than talking about irreducible national interests, then from there going into which critical theaters do we have to hold, then from there going to the force posture and assets and what we need and the money that we need to spend. We start the conversation, at least in Washington, well, this is our defense budget. We're spending about 3.1 and change, right, of our GDP, which, by the way, is historic low, because if you factor inflation into it, we're spending maybe 2.7% if you look at the cost of weapons and the rest of it. We are unable to produce weapons at speed and scale. We're building these exquisite precision platforms, but with very limited numbers. For 20 years, we fought scheduled wars for all practical purposes, John. We could decide on such and such a day, we're going to launch an Iraq operation, and we need so much in terms of logistics and equipment, just-in-time delivery. So we consolidated our defense infrastructure. We have only 5 prime defense and space contractors in the US left, in part because administration after administration said no more big orders, just-in-time deliveries. Well,
Yeah.
right now we're looking at this. We're looking at the levels of equipment attrition. We're looking at ammunition consumption. We're looking at, the attrition of personnel. If you look at the sizes of our military, and then we understand the logistics will be under threat. So I'll give you an example. When the war in Ukraine started, the second one in 2022, during the first offensive, the Ukrainians were shooting about 4,000 to 5,000 rounds of howitzer ammunition per day. The Russians were at 25,000 on average. They're going up to 40, 50, and 60. The US was producing 15,000 rounds of howitzer ammunition per month. The Ukrainians were shooting in 3 days what we produced in a month. This year, there's been a leak from NATO that went into the press. It is estimated that the Russians will produce almost 3 times as much of howitzer ammunition as the United States and Europe combined. So think about it. They're on a wartime footing. They're producing mass quantities. Yeah, those weapons are inferior to what we have. The Russian tanks are terrible. But every tank takes a missile, a javelin, a round. And if you don't care about the lives of your crew, and you start driving and it's only 20 miles to Vilnius, for example, from the border, less than 200 kilometers to Warsaw, and you run out of ammunition, look what's going to happen. Think of the amount of money we spend defending Israel. We're shooting millions of dollars in missiles and ordnance at $10,000 drones. This is unsustainable.
Well, speaking of the more kinetic aspect of warfighting, at what point do you think the United States and its Western allies lost the plot with regard to the revolution on military affairs? During the late 70s, early 1980s, we had this thinking in the US predominantly, but it also infected its allies, where we thought that quality would be able to, trump, pardon the pun, quantity. Now, in a very real sense, as you rightly mentioned, that is true. But then again, if we dig a little bit deeper in the American military industrial complex, Sorry, couldn't find a different adjective for it. You know, you find graft, you find corruption, very clever forms, of course, not quite as subtle as the Russians and the Chinese, but certainly something very sophisticated and something that affects the pricing of equipment. And the pricing of equipment, as you rightly point out, is so goddamn expensive that building to scale is now impossible in the modern age. I mean, you can have the idea of producing maybe a handful of, F-22 fighters or a handful of F-35s or maybe 2 or 3 warships, per year, if you're lucky with the sort of modern technology you're putting in. And yes, they may be able to shoot down um, whatever many that the of platforms that the enemy can throw at us. But in the end, all that rubbish equipment, as you rightly pointed out, that is being aimed at the US and its allies right now, with meat wave after meat wave, will accomplish its role, as bloody and as awful as it sounds, over and above what we can put on the table. So how do we get over this? Because this is now a disease that started off in the United States, it spread all over the Western Alliance, and everyone's scrambling around looking for a way out of this situation where we too can produce affordable weapons at scale so we can fight state-on-state wars once again.
Well, I think a lot has to do with actually listening to the military. I'll give you an example. Energy weapons, lasers, they should
Yeah.
be on every ship, every boat that we have. You can then destroy an incoming drone at a cost of maybe $10 per cycle. Now,
Yeah.
of course, there are too many lawyers in all of this saying, where does it go if it misses? Does it hit a satellite? Does it hit a commercial airliner and whatnot? My answer is it goes to God. I don't care. You need to have
Yeah.
equipment that allows you at a reasonable cost to offset the mass that the other will throw at you. Look, the Russians the Russians are fighting today in Ukraine the way the Soviets have fought and the Russians have always fought.
Yeah.
It's dumb. It's mass. But you know what? It's worked for them for over 300 years. And they want us to fight that fight.
Yeah.
And precision can only get you so far. I mean, in the Indo-Pacific, precision will be more important because it's a long fight. And we have tyranny of the distance and the rest of it. But it's a very different fight in Europe, because if you look at how NATO is organized, the Russians will set up that fight if they decide to invade, and they will move. They will be in the fight, so to speak, even before the fight starts, because we will see everything. But I think it'll be very hard for NATO to preempt for political reasons. So we're in the situation. The second thing is we need to redesign our mindset in what we expect of platforms. The building of an F-35 is not really a production line. It's like building a Bentley. It's exquisite engineers, technicians, assembling it, if you will, almost by hand. So you can only produce a few of those. During the Second World War, there's a brilliant book on this. It's called Freedom's Forge, I believe, or Freedom's Foundry, Freedom's Forge. It talks about how U.S. private industry stepped in and became the arsenal of democracy. You could go to Chrysler and say, stop, building cars, start building tanks. Singer sewing machines, stop building machines, sewing machines, build M1 rifles. And that private industry actually outproduced anything that was out there. So maybe the Sherman tank was not the most successful tank, but we produced 50 for every German Tiger, and just the sheer mass. We're in an inverted situation right now.
Are we also not in a situation where in the United States, and you touched on this earlier, and I think it's a very important point for our audience to understand, and that is with regard to the production of sophisticated weapons, we've got a handful of arms manufacturers now. In a way, we've never been in this situation before. Prior to the Cold War, during World War II, for instance, we had large companies, but there were these antitrust laws that prevented them from monopolizing everything. Now we're in a globalized society with, I think about 5 major US companies that control pretty much 99% of what comes out of US stables. I mean, that obviously is an anti-competitive issue that will affect the scale of production, and it will affect what a government can ask a company to do, because the company has its own power base, it's got its own organizational imperatives, and it can also push back to government. So at what point should we start thinking about breaking up some of the bigger defense houses, if you will, and shake the system up from the ground up?
I actually think it's a question of requirements that government needs to set. I'll give you an example. The Thompson submachine gun at the beginning of the Second World War in 1941 for us cost $230 to make. By 1943, it cost $75 to make. By 1945, it cost $45 to make. The Brits would set a requirement for the Sten gun saying it had to cost less than 19 pounds to produce. And the industry adapted. The industry started simplifying, using stamping instead of milling, cutting costs. Everybody did that. The Germans did the same thing if you look at how they produced their machine guns and the rest of it. So you need the government to come in and very forcefully say, the cost and volume is what's going to be driving this or that aspect of it. That's one thing. The second thing is, our entire professional military force model, which I think is partly responsible for the current predicament we're in. We have no reserves. Our National Guard is probably the best we have in terms of what we can field, but our authorized, NDAA authorized numbers are 1.3 million roughly. The shortfalls in recruitment for every service except for the Marine Corps are such that you're probably closer to 1 million, if not under. Okay. Nowhere during the Cold War did we drop below 2 million. At the height of the Vietnam War in 1967, we had a force of 3.5 million, and the draft was still in place. Yeah. We have also forfeited something. If you look at the US Constitution, we're a quintessentially naval power. We have the Navy written into our Constitution. Congress shall maintain the Navy. It will raise an army, but maintain the Navy. If you look at the map, if you look at the hemisphere, we're a continental island, if you will. And we live in an incredibly secure neighborhood. A lot of threatening Canadians to the north, a lot of dangerous Mexicans to the south, right? And a lot of water east and west. So until you get to really modern weapons, satellites, air power, and all of that, it's a blessing that America could develop from these 13 subsistence colonies, into this incredible, powerful republic. We need to start thinking again about mass. The citizen soldier idea. We've created a culture of security consumers. I had a conversation over dinner with a friend here, and I kind of asked him, do you feel responsible for national defense? And he said, I pay my taxes. We have a professional military. I mean, in a sense, maybe, but not really. I said, so you think of our military like a security guard at the mall? And he started laughing. No, that's not how it is. Well, actually, to a large extent, we have lost that sense of citizens being responsible. I'll give you an example of a tiny nation, Finland, 5.5 million. Everybody serves from 18 to 60. They change their specializations as they, develop their career paths in the civilian world, but they can raise an army of 280,000 at the drop of a hat. And they can go to 800,000 civilian and military in an emergency. Trust in government is off the chart. In a country like the United States, and I wrote a piece recently calling for the restoration of national military service, you lose something fundamental when you have no space where people of all races, all wealth, all class, can meet and discover that they owe something to each other. There's a nation out there.
Yep.
And unfortunately, ever since Nixon, ended the draft to kind of calm down the campuses, we have started moving in the direction of this consumer culture. And we need to rebuild that sense of citizenship and responsibility and service. And I'm not saying this lightly. It should be in the military sphere. It should be on the civilian side. We should go back to this traditional American ideal that we are a republic, and that we all owe something to each other, and that we have some understanding of the rest of society. There's a very ugly expression in American English these days, flyover country. I don't know if you've heard that. That to me is one of the most devastating indictments of what is happening, where somehow, unless you live in one of the coastal corridors, West Coast or East Coast, you're somehow not in the same category. We're all citizens. We all owe something to each other. And I'm not sounding like a Boy Scout here. This is really important.
No, look, I agree with you. And I think that, One of my forebears back in the back in 1400s in Florence wrote a book, De Militia, and it was all about creating a citizen soldiery because, of course, the Italian city-states were fighting against each other with mercenary or the condottieri, which
Sure.
proved to be a very unreliable and rather dangerous way of looking after your national security. And what we're seeing today is really a Praetorian Guard being structured by the state, where the military forces are actually divorced from the community that they're meant to be serving. So national service, where you're drawing from the general public across racial, ethnic, and religious boundaries, brings people together under that rubric of national security. It allows us to become stakeholders in the nation as it once was. But of course, that's a very controversial topic to discuss. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Washington, D.C., we're speaking with Senior Fellow and Director of the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council of the United States, Dr. Andrew A. Michta. Andrew, you advocate for a dramatic shift in how democracies manage their defense and economic policies. What are the first steps you believe the US should take to adapt to this new reality? And do you think these steps can be readily transferred to America's allies, say, for instance, Britain and Australia?
Well, first of all, we need to reshore critical supply chains to the United States. You cannot, as I said, you cannot expect to be able to run an independent foreign and security policy if you depend on your adversary for the critical supply chains. I mean, that's just basic logic. The Europeans are talking about de-risking right now, which I think is trying to find a compromise. I don't think that will do. De-risking to me is a bit like saying, yeah, Dad, I'm going to smoke marijuana, but only in the morning, and I will not drive. The reality is, as long as we stay in the Chinese markets, the Chinese are going to continue to steal our intellectual property, and they're going to leverage every asset they possibly have. I'll give you an example. There was an attempt recently by Senators Casey, Democrat of Pennsylvania, and Cornyn, Republican of Texas, bipartisan, to introduce what they called the Transparency Amendment to the NDAA that would just require U.S. private equity to report to the Treasury what they spend money on in China, because we're spending money on AI research in China. We're spending money on advanced chip design in China. I think in 2019, when I did some research on this, out of about 1 million foreign students, we had 370,000 Chinese grad students in STEM. I mean, we're training their weapons designers, access to our labs, our R&D facilities. And what I'm saying here about decoupling goes also for your country and for countries across the West. We need to finally restore national security as the irreducible function of the state. We need to bring it back into economic policy making. Okay, and if that means initial pain, governments need to work with the incentives, tax policies, but these are national security priorities. We need to have that. So that's the first step. The second step is, I am not so sure how innovative the Chinese economy really is. I mean, when I look at their submarine designs, for example, at their weapon systems design, they've made some advances, but I am not sure that they can really innovate autonomously without continued access to our R&D base. And at the very minimum, as they say in Tennessee, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. The first thing is cut it off. We've had reports that 1 in 5 American companies doing business in China was extorted for intellectual property in exchange for market access. And if when I talk to business people and I say, why do you continue doing this? They say, well, it's just the cost of doing business. We still make more money. The second thing is, by deindustrializing, we have truly undercut our systemic political stability, because our middle class continues to shrink. And the middle class, I think in the US, it's just about 50% right now of our population. Middle class is the most conservative, small c element of your society. It's very risk averse in the sense that it dreams of becoming upper class. It fears of dropping down. So it cannot be easily mobilized for radical politics. It's and it was largely autonomous if you look at the blue collar professions in our country. And now with deindustrialization and offshoring, we have created a situation where extreme politics increasingly begin to dominate, and both on the left and on the right. And the center is less and less stable. And we're losing the ability to negotiate a compromise. We're losing the ability again to think of ourselves as citizens of the same nation, of the same family, if you will. So we need to recognize that China and Russia are intent on rewriting the rules of the game in a way that will disadvantage us, possibly permanently, if we allow this to continue. Now, my country has a wonderful tradition. People joke, America will always do everything wrong, and then it will get to the right solution, right? I think it was Bismarck who allegedly said that God watches over bums, drunks, and the United States of America. I don't know if he actually said that, but it sounds pretty good. But it's time we start making these right decisions. And we need straight talk about what's at stake. We are the largest economy, but if you look at the structure of that economy, how much of it is in finance, how much of it is in healthcare, how much of this is in services, and what do we actually have when it comes to the manufacturing base? There are certain verities to great power politics, and one of them is that a robust economy that can produce in the event of war at speed and scale is a sine qua non of a great power status. It's that simple. And when people say, well, complex interdependence, the Chinese will not, well, trust me, we've had cases like, if you look before the First World War, the dependence of different economies in Europe, right, that didn't prevent from that horrific explosion happening. And yeah, we're not so much interdependent as we're dependent on our adversaries. And I think this needs to stop.
You mentioned that hard times produce leaders. What qualities should these leaders have, and how can current political figures transition to this kind of leadership?
I use this comparison to what we call the greatest generation that we celebrate in America to this day. If you think about it, those were kids of the Great Depression. Those were tough hombres, right? These were guys who worked on farms, who worked in factories, who slaughtered animals, who produced machines. I suspect when they were drafted, they probably were underweight, and getting, a cot, 3 square meals a day, and a pack of cigarettes, which at that time was standard issue, was a good deal. Yeah. Tough times produce leaders. And I think one of the problems we have across the West is that we've lived through an unprecedented time of low risk, incredible prosperity. I look at Europe. Europe is about half a billion people, roughly. It's been rolling in butter for 30 years. You tell me that Europe, with its wealth and resources, cannot produce the core of conventional deterrent and defense force within NATO? Are you kidding me? We're arguing over percentages of GDP on defense, 2%, 3%. Quite frankly, I don't care. You can spend 10% of it, but if most of it goes to personnel and retirements and all of that, what are you really producing? So we need to talk about real exercise capabilities. I think it's a crisis that should generate leaders. I'll give you an example. 9/11 for the US was one of those moments where we were one nation. We were so angry, so mobilized, so ready. We were asking our leaders, we're asking President Bush, ask something of us. We're here. When I was in Afghanistan in 2013, I ran into officers who volunteered out of college, to serve. And remember what happened? President George W. Bush told us to go shopping, take a trip. Do you know why I say national service is so important? It's because if you have a strictly professional military like we do, and I'm sure in terms of the skill set and capability, they're probably off the charts compared to what a draft-based or national service-based military would be producing. But if you don't have citizens involved in this, you can wield that military as a blunt hammer without any political costs associated with that, right? I mean, we've fought these scheduled wars for the last 20 years, and most of our nation was kind of disconnected from it. I mean, we sympathized, we talked, we had yellow ribbons and the rest of it, but all these wars were fought by 0.5% of American population, their families and friends. And so there's something fundamentally wrong with this, because if you have to go to the citizens and say, we need to take this drastic step of going to war, and I need to ask you to put your skin in the game, that's a very different conversation for a politician than saying, okay, we're going to send, 2 or 3 brigades to do X, Y, Z. So that aspect of it. And I have to tell you, I'm also discouraged that I don't see young men and women involved in politics understood as service. A lot of conversations I hear, it's understood as a path to a career. I'm in Washington right now. I'm back from Europe about 9 months. It's a bubble. We're living in an echo chamber here. It's like a huge corporate town, if you will, when it comes to politics. So I would like to get back to this quintessentially American tradition of public service as service. You get off the farm to serve, and then you come back. You don't stay, your entire professional life, and then when you're in your 80s or 90s, you still stay and continue doing it. I think we need generational change. I think we need fresh blood. We need people who can relate to the younger generation and speak their language. All of that creates the fabric of a working democratic society.
I mean, I love what you're saying, Andrew. I have actually heard a lot of this over the years from the fringes, including myself, of our defense and national security apparatus here in Australia. And, I can honestly say that the powers that be, shall we describe them that way, those people who are professional officers in a professional military will not want to have their rank and file diluted by conscripts. And there's this old saying that conscripts, once you start going down that particular path, your professional cadre will be nothing more than a training cadre and will not be able to rotate into theaters for action, except unless they're the elite of the elite. So, how do you, I mean, you can make a convincing argument for making the public general stakeholders in a new form of national service. How do you then convince the military leadership that this is the way to go when the military leaders are resistant to seeing themselves as leaders of a professional military?
So, I just retired from the Defense Department about 9 months ago. When I was in Germany, at the Marshall Center, I had U.S. officers, lieutenant colonels, European officers. A couple of them were flag officers, German colonels who worked for me, and the rest of it. And I hear your argument, and I know there's a professional ethos in it, but I also know that most of the military officers realize that the current model generates forces that are too small. I mean, if you look at the requirements of today's battlefield, we have a military in the US now structured for one major theater, one secondary theater. We have 2 major crises brewing, one in the Atlantic, the other one in the Pacific. Our political class wants to address this by talking about pivoting away from Europe and focusing on Asia. Well, guess what? These 2 theaters are interconnected. They're not an either or proposition. If we lose credibility and staying power in one, we're going to lose it in the other. The Chinese are watching. If we have the fire in our belly to actually see it through, to stick with it, to deliver it, can we still stand up and be counted? I mean, this is all a pretty straightforward proposition. And so to have the reserves that you need and trained personnel that you need to have that. And mind you, this doesn't have to be, 2 years in uniform. It can be 9 months. It can be up to a year or even shorter with periodic retraining. But people who are constantly connected, who bring their skill sets, I mean, IT professionals or medical professionals, serving in the military, adapting their skills to those requirements. I mean, that is a win-win for everybody. And finally, we're so fascinated by technology. US military, US Army in particular, used to be about mass,
Yeah.
right? If you look at how we fought World War I, World War II, we would raise large mass armies, go there, sit on top of the adversary, come back, demobilize, and whatnot. But as you got into this professional framework and the army started shrinking, I would argue it acquired an Air Force mindset. The Air Force has always been about precision, long range and this kind of stuff. We need to go back to some of the fundamentals of what the different services are supposed to be. And also we need to re-embed the military back in our society, because professional militaries are, yes, they're part of every democratic society and we respect them, but civilians know precious little about the military culture, and they think what they see in Hollywood is really how it is. No, it's not. And so this in and of itself, once again, would strengthen the fabric of our democratic societies. I hope and pray that we will get leaders both in Asia, in the US, in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, that will stand up and be counted, and that will speak to the public about how dangerous this Darwinian world is becoming around us. The United States emerged from the Cold War with unprecedented resources and power, and kind of almost a sense of we can do anything we want. And I think we misread, to some extent, it was trauma of 9/11. And I lost a friend in the North Tower. I lost two friends at the Pentagon. I was just as angry and furious and ready, to do what we needed to do. But understanding that it's very hard to remake societies in our image, that cultures are extremely difficult to change. We've lived through 3 decades of what I call the triumph of the institutionalists. You've heard nation building, state building. Well, guess what? Nations build themselves. You don't build them. Yeah. Properly crafted institutions usually yield to cultures because cultures are entrenched and embedded. It takes a lot of effort. And people telling me, well, look at democratic Japan. Well, yeah, but you're talking about a country that was completely defeated and occupied. And same with West Germany. I mean, becoming a democracy was an act of surrender for all practical purposes. And then we stayed there for generations. So some humility, less hubris, and I think more respect for the citizenry. That's what I keep telling everyone who would like to listen.
Andrew, final question. The assassination attempt on former US President Donald Trump has almost guaranteed his victory for a second term in November 24. But as he is far more narrowly focused on the threat posed by China in the Indo-Pacific and seems to be indicating a desire to move away from European security and the defense of Ukraine, how do you see Europe adapt to new realities should Trump sweep the polls?
So every time I'm in Europe, John, it takes about 5 minutes before what I call Trump derangement syndrome sets in, especially if you're in a policy community. Right? If you're talking to policy wonks or government officials, it's Trump, 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 Trump. Oh my God. And I always tell my European friends, you don't have a relationship with this or that politician, this or that political party. You have a vital national security relationship with the United States of America. Work the problem, people. Keep the channel open to both campaigns. In our system, it's a binary proposition. You either will get a Republican or a Democrat. Europeans don't understand. Most of European governments are creatures of their parliaments, right? I mean, so they think that we, for all practical purposes, elect a king with incredible executive powers in place. So you have to be able to work this. Second point that I would make, if Trump becomes president, I would speculate that you would have a lot of pressure on the European NATO members to really do what they have promised to do. Remember, at the Vilnius summit, every nation that participated back then signed on to the new regional plans that NATO has adopted, that SACEUR and SHAPE and EUCOM developed. Those plans have specific commitments when it comes to capabilities. These are binding pledges. I frankly would expect nothing less but to hold some feet to the fire and say enough. we have a storm brewing in the Indo-Pacific. We are going to be here. And I don't believe the argument that you hear, oh my God, Donald Trump will take us out of NATO, this and the other. No, he will put a lot of pressure, I think, on the Europeans. The problem set will remain, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. The size of the US military will not change overnight. The pressures in the Indo-Pacific will not disappear overnight. The fact that the Europeans are not doing what they should be doing will not be changed overnight unless they get serious about it. It's been 2.5 years since the second war in Ukraine started. Where's the beef? The countries on the flank, they do what needs to be done. The Poles are spending at 4%. The Finns have the largest conventional artillery. NATO has enlarged to the northeast and all of that. But once you start moving away from the flank, the conversation changes. So NATO is politically unified when it comes to the threat Russia poses, but there's a very different appetite for risk-taking when you move away from the flank. So when you're in Berlin, it's much less intense in terms of the threat perception. There's still a conversation about how do we get to the resolution of this conflict? How do we stabilize the situation? The French, when I'm in Paris, they talk about the Mediterranean and how important the Sahel is and Africa, their traditional interests. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese are now running all over Africa, that's grating very much on where the French interests are. And I joke when I get to Lisbon, I have no idea what they're talking about except for immigration. So my point is there's this regionalized security optics across Europe. So the problem is not so much who's going to be elected in the United States, because it's our domestic political process. And frankly, Europeans taking positions on this and pontificating and tweeting, they're only stepping into our domestic political debate. And it serves no one, because if they alienate this or that candidate or campaign, think of how much harder it will be for them to engage. So I tell my European friends, calm down, stop freaking out, to use the vernacular of my daughter's generation, and make sure you're talking to both campaigns, but most of all, make sure you meet your obligations. Because even if you get a Democrat president and not a Republican president, the fact that NATO needs Europe to provide the bulk of conventional deterrence and defense is not going to change. We will be there with our, nuclear umbrella, high-end enablers, our contingent, our portion of that. But the time when the United States could provide 70, 80% of everything that NATO had, that time is over.
Dr. Andrew A. Michta, thanks for joining us on The Focus today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening.
That was Senior Fellow and Director of the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council of the United States, Dr. Andrew A. Michta. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Andrew Michta. To learn more about Andrew and connect with him on social media, check out the links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we would appreciate your 5-star reviews. Have comments or questions about this podcast? Drop them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many of them as I can. Stay connected with us on social media. Follow me at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.